The war was a phantom behind them. As the black-prowed ships cut through the Aegean, the towering walls of Troy, now a smouldering pyre of broken stone and ash, sank beneath the horizon. For 10 years, the salt air had been masked by the scent of bronze, blood, and burning cedar. Now, for the first time, the wind tasted only of the sea. Odysseus stood at the steer-oar of the lead vessel, his hands calloused by the grip of his spear and the weight of his shield. He was a man of 40 years, yet his reflection in the dark water revealed the haggard lines of a century. He looked at his men, 12 ships' worth of Ithacans, Ciconians, and Cephallenians, and saw not conquerors, but ghosts. They were rich with the spoils of Priam's city, their hulls low in the water with tripod cauldrons and captured gold, but their eyes were fixed on the west. "The wind is fair, King of Ithaca," Eurylochus called out, his voice cracking with a rare, jagged joy. 12 days, perhaps? 14? If the gods hold their breath, we shall see the peaks of Neriton before the moon thins. Odysseus nodded, though a cold stone sat in his gut. He knew the gods rarely held their breath. They were fickle spectators who had spent a decade treating the plains of Troy like a gaming board. To think they would simply allow the victors to walk away unchallenged was a soldier's hope, not a strategist's logic. The fleet did not sail directly for the open sea. Greed and the logistical necessity of supplies drew them to the coast of Thrace, the land of the Cicones. To Odysseus, it was a tactical stop. To his men, it was an opportunity to exert the dominance they had learned in the trenches of Troy. They fell upon the city of Ismarus with the practiced efficiency of wolves. Odysseus gave the order to sack the city, but spared the temple of Apollo, protecting the priest Maron. It was a calculated move of piety, a hedge against divine wrath. In gratitude, Maron gifted Odysseus 12 jars of wine, a vintage so potent and dark that it required 20 parts water to 1 part wine to be drinkable. "We have what we need," Odysseus commanded as the sun began to dip, casting long, bloody shadows across the Thracian sands. "The wine is stowed, the grain is bagged. To the ships. Now." But the men of Ithaca were no longer the disciplined sailors who had left home 20 years prior. They were intoxicated, not just by Maron's wine, but by the momentum of victory. They slaughtered sheep by the shore and lit great fires, laughing as the smoke drifted toward the mountains. "One more night, Captain!" they shouted, their faces flushed. "The beds are soft and the meat is fresh. Troy is dead. Let us live!" Odysseus watched the heights above the city. He saw the glint of bronze in the moonlight, the Cicones of the interior, neighbors of the city they had just plundered, were rallying. They were inland tribes, trained to fight from chariots, and they were coming in numbers that dwarfed his tired crew. The dawn did not bring the sun. It brought a tide of spears. The Cicones swept down from the hills like a mountain torrent. The shore became a chaotic slaughterhouse. The Ithacans, sluggish from their revelry, fought with their backs to the surf. Odysseus moved through the fray, his mind a cold engine of survival. He parried, thrust, and shouted orders, trying to funnel his men back to the ships. The water turned a murky purple as the tide came in, mingling with the blood of his companions. By the time the ships managed to push off into the breakers, the toll was heavy. 6 men from every ship were missing from the benches. As they rowed away, the rhythmic splash of the oars felt like a funeral dirge. They did not cheer their escape. Instead, as was the custom, They called out the names of the dead 3 times, their voices carrying over the waves until the wind snatched the sounds away. If Ismarus was a wound, what followed was a shattering. As they cleared the Cape of Malea, the final gateway to the Ionian Sea and the home stretch to Ithaca, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. Zeus, the cloud-gatherer, unleashed a north wind that tore the sails to ribbons. The masts groaned under the strain, snapping like dry twigs. For 9 days, the fleet was driven across the fish-cold sea, stripped of direction, stripped of hope, and pushed far beyond the edges of the known world. When the winds finally died, the water was a flat, eerie turquoise. The stars were unfamiliar. The air was heavy with a sweet, cloying scent that smelled of honey and lethargy. They had reached the land of the lotus eaters, and the journey home had truly, terrifyingly begun. The silence was the first thing that bothered Odysseus. After the screaming gale of the north wind, the world had gone unnaturally quiet. The 12 ships drifted into a wide, shallow bay, where the water was as clear and still as a polished mirror. No gulls cried. No surf thundered against the cliffs. There was only the rhythmic, sluggish dip of the oars and the heavy, floral scent that rolled off the island in golden waves. It was the scent of a summer afternoon that never ended. It smelled of honey, sun-warmed dust, and the deep, dark sleep of a child. Odysseus stood at the prow, his hand gripping the recurve bow he had not yet had cause to string. His men were ragged, their tunics stiff with salt, and their eyes bloodshot from 9 days of battling the storm. "We do not all go ashore," Odysseus commanded, his voice raspy. "Eurylochus, pick 2 men, scout the interior, find out what people live here, if they are bread-eaters like us, or savages who feast on the flesh of guests." The scouts dropped into the surf, their boots splashing softly. The rest of the crew slumped against the gunwales, mesmerized by the shimmering heat haze dancing over the dunes. Odysseus watched them go, a nagging instinct prickling at the back of his neck. In his experience, a land that offered no resistance often hid the most dangerous traps. Hours bled into the afternoon. The sun hung stationary in the sky, refusing to sink. When the scouts did not return, Odysseus felt the first cold spike of alarm. He gathered a small band of veterans and waded ashore. They found the scouts less than a mile inland, sitting in a circle with a group of locals. These lotus eaters were not monsters. They had no tusks, no extra eyes, and carried no weapons. They were a gentle, shadowy people, with eyes that seemed fixed on something miles beyond the horizon. One of the Ithacan scouts, a sturdy rower named Polites, sat cross-legged among them. He was smiling, a vacant, blissful expression Odysseus hadn't seen since they left the shores of Ithaca 2 decades ago. In his hand, he held a flowery fruit, its skin the color of a bruised sunset. "Polites," Odysseus barked. "Report! What have you found?" Polites looked up, but his eyes didn't seem to focus on his king. "Why are you shouting, Odysseus? Sit. The sun is warm. The fruit, it tastes of home, but better. I don't remember the war. I don't remember the blood. I don't even remember the rowing." He took another bite, his jaw moving with slow, rhythmic satisfaction. "The ships," Odysseus said, stepping forward. "We leave at sunset. The wind is shifting." "The ships are heavy," another scout murmured, leaning back into the soft grass. The oars are splinters in the hand. Why go back to a rocky island and a wife who has likely forgotten us? Here, there is only the now. Odysseus realized the horror of the place. This wasn't a death of the body. It was a death of the will. The Lotus Eaters didn't kill their guests. They simply extinguished the fire in their souls. They offered a mercy that was a slow-acting poison, the gift of forgetting who you were. Back! Odysseus turned to his veterans, his voice cracking like a whip. Do not touch the fruit! Cover your mouths! He didn't argue with the scouts. He didn't plead with them. He and his veterans seized the three men by their tunics and dragged them, kicking and weeping, back toward the beach. The scouts wailed as if they were being led to the executioner's block, begging to go back to the flowery meadows, their memories of wives and children dissolving like mist in the sun. Reaching the shore, Odysseus didn't just put them on the ships. He lashed them to the rowing benches beneath the thwart planks, their hands bound so they could not jump overboard, to swim back to the honey-scented shore. Pull! Odysseus roared, standing at the stern as the ships cleared the harbor. Row until your hearts burst! If you taste the air of this place for one more hour, you will never see the smoke rising from your own chimneys again. The men rowed with a desperate, frantic energy, driven by the sight of their weeping comrades. As the island faded into a golden speck on the horizon, the peace of the Lotus Eaters felt more terrifying than any storm Zeus could conjure. Odysseus stared ahead into the darkening north. He had saved their lives, but the incident had left him shaken. If a mere flower could strip a man of his home, what would happen when they encountered a foe that actually fought back? The answer lay just beyond the next headland, where the smoke of high volcanic peaks rose into the clouds, the land of the Cyclopes. The scent of the lotus had barely faded from their lungs when the horizon shifted from a hazy gold to a jagged, volcanic black. They had reached the land of the Cyclopes, a race of lawless giants who knew nothing of the plough, the assembly, or the sacred laws of Xenia, the ancient Greek code of guest friendship. While the rest of the fleet stayed anchored at a nearby deserted island teeming with wild goats, Odysseus, driven by a fatal curiosity and a hunger for guest gifts, took his single ship and 12 of his bravest men to the mainland. He carried with him a skin of Meron's dark, potent wine, a heavy, unmixed vintage that smelled of fire and honey. They found a cave near the sea, screened by laurel bushes and fenced with massive rhombs of fieldstone. Inside, the cavern was a testament to a strange, brutal order. Crates groaned under the weight of drying cheeses, and pens were overflowing with lambs and kids, sorted meticulously by age. "Let us take the cheese and go, Captain," Eurylochus whispered, his hand trembling on his sword hilt. "The goats, too. We can be back at the ships before the owner returns." "No," Odysseus replied, his eyes narrowing in the gloom. "I wish to see the man who lives here. I wish to see what gift he offers." It was the greatest mistake of his life. As the sun dipped, the ground began to shudder. A shadow fell across the cavern mouth, broader than a galley's sail. Polyphemus, a son of Poseidon, entered. He was a mountain of a man, with a single, lidless eye set in the center of his forehead like a crater. He carried a forest's worth of dry wood, which he crashed onto the floor, and then, with a casual strength that turned the Ithacan's blood to ice, he rolled a boulder across the entrance. The stone was so massive that 22 four-wheeled wagons could not have budged it. When the giant finally noticed the men cowering in the shadows, his voice was like the grinding of tectonic plates. Who are you? Traders? Or pirates who roam the seas bringing ruin to others? Odysseus stepped forward, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. He appealed to the gods, invoking Zeus, the protector of travelers. Polyphemus laughed, a dry, hacking sound. We Cyclopes care nothing for your cloud-gatherer Zeus. We are stronger than the gods. Without another word, the giant reached out, snatched up two of Odysseus's companions, and dashed their brains against the rocky floor, like puppy dogs. He devoured them whole, bones, marrow, and flesh, washing them down with buckets of raw milk before falling into a thunderous, shaking sleep. Odysseus drew his sword, ready to plunge it into the giant's liver, but he stopped. If he killed the Cyclops now, they would all die anyway, trapped behind the immovable boulder. He needed the giant alive to open the door. The next evening, after Polyphemus had consumed 2 more men for breakfast and 2 more for dinner, Odysseus stepped out of the shadows with the wooden bowl of Maron's wine. "Cyclops," he said, "you have feasted on man's flesh. Now, wash it down with this wine." The giant drank, and then he drank again. The potent, unwatered alcohol hit his system like a thunderbolt. "I like this," the giant belched, his eye rolling in his head. "Tell me your name, little man, and I will give you a gift." "My name is Nobody," Odysseus replied. "That is what my mother and father call me." "Then here is my gift, Nobody," Polyphemus grunted, his head lurching toward the straw. "I will eat you last, after all your friends. That is my guest gift." As the giant drifted into a drunken stupor, vomiting bits of wine and human flesh, Odysseus and his 4 remaining men took a massive spar of olive wood they had sharpened and hardened in the fire. With a coordinated heave, they drove the red-hot point into the giant's single eye. The scream that followed tore through the cavern. Polyphemus clawed at his face, pulling the glowing stake from his socket. He bellowed for his neighbors, the other Cyclopes who lived in the surrounding crags. "What ails you, Polyphemus?" they shouted from outside the blocked entrance. "Is someone stealing your flocks? Is someone trying to kill you?" "Nobody is killing me," Polyphemus roared in agony. "Nobody has blinded me by fraud." "Well," the other giants grumbled, turning back to their caves, "if nobody is hurting you, then your sickness must be from Zeus. Pray to your father Poseidon." To get out of the cave, Odysseus tied his men to the bellies of the giant's prize rams. When the blinded Polyphemus rolled away the stone the next morning to let his flock out, he felt the backs of the sheep to make sure no men were escaping. He never thought to check beneath them. Odysseus was the last to leave, clinging to the fleece of the lead ram. As he passed through the door, the giant stopped the animal, whispering to his favorite beast about how they would find Nobody and crush him. But the ram moved on, and Odysseus dropped to the grass, a free man. They scrambled back to the ship, hauling the stolen sheep aboard. They were in the surf, but were safe. They were in the surf, but Odysseus, his heart swollen with the triumph of his own intellect, could not stay silent. "Cyclops!" he shouted over the waves as they rode. "If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, who lives in Ithaca." The giant let out a roar of pure fury. He tore the peak off a mountain and hurled it at the sound of the voice, the massive rock narrowly missing the ship's stern. Then he raised his hands to the darkened sky and prayed to his father, Poseidon. "Hear me, Earth-shaker. If I am truly your son, grant that Odysseus never reaches home. But if he must return, let him come late, in a foreign ship, having lost all his comrades, to find a house of pain." The prayer drifted up to the heavens, and the god of the sea listened. The journey, which should have been a few weeks' sail, had just become a 10-year exile. The ship, still trembling from the near miss of the Cyclops' mountain peak, found its way to a strange, floating island. This was Aeolia, a kingdom walled in indestructible bronze and perched atop sheer uncliffs. Here lived Aeolus, the son of Hippotas, whom Zeus had made the keeper of the winds. Unlike the brutal Polyphemus, Aeolus was the pinnacle of Xenia. He welcomed Odysseus and his weary crew into his palace, where they feasted for a full month. Odysseus, ever the storyteller, regaled the king with tales of Troy, the wooden horse, and the long road of the Achaeans. When Odysseus finally begged to leave, Aeolus did more than just grant permission. He gave him a gift that should have guaranteed a swift return to Ithaca. Aeolus gathered the energy of every blustering, chaotic wind that could blow a ship off course, the north, the south, and the east, and bound them tightly inside a bag made from the hide of a full-grown ox. He tied the neck of the bag with a silver cord so tight that not even a stray puff could leak out. "Only the west wind, Zephyr, is left free," Aeolus instructed. "He will blow against your sails and carry you straight to your rocky home." For 9 days and 9 nights, the journey was perfect. Odysseus stayed at the helm himself, refusing to sleep, his eyes fixed on the horizon. On the 10th day, the miracle happened. They saw Ithaca. They were so close they could see the people tending the signal fires on the shore. Odysseus could smell the smoke of his own hearth. Exhausted by his vigil and certain that the danger had passed, his eyelids grew heavy. He slumped against the mast and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. As their captain slept, the crew began to whisper. They looked at the ox-hide bag sitting by Odysseus's feet. "Look at the luck of our leader," Eurylochus muttered. "He returns with crates of gold and bronze from Troy, while we go home with empty hands. And now King Aeolus has given him a secret treasure in that bag. Gold? Silver? He keeps it all for himself." Driven by a decade of resentment and the proximity of home, they untied the silver cord. They didn't find gold. The moment the seal was broken, the compressed fury of the captured winds exploded outward. It was a physical force that shrieked like 1,000 dying gods. The ships were snatched up by the gale and blasted backward, away from the shores of Ithaca, away from their families, and back out into the heart of the deep, dark sea. Odysseus woke to the sound of his world tearing apart. He saw his home receding into the mist, and, for a moment, contemplated throwing himself overboard to end his misery in the salt. But he stayed his hand, muffled his head in his cloak, and lay on the deck as the winds drove them back to the one place they had already been. The fleet washed back up on the shores of Aeolia. A humbled, broken Odysseus returned to the palace of the king, begging for help once more. But the atmosphere had changed. Aeolus looked at the haggard king, not with pity, but with horror. "Begone from this island, most cursed of all living men," Aeolus roared. "It is not right for me to help a man whom the blessed gods loathe. Your return here is proof that the immortals have set their hearts against you. Get out!" Driven away by the only man who could have helped them, the crew was forced to do what they dreaded most: row. With no wind at all, neither fair nor foul, they spent 6 days and nights at the oars until their hands bled and their spirits broke. On the 7th day, they reached the harbor of Lamos, the city of the Laestrygonians. They thought they had found a safe haven. In reality, they had found a slaughterhouse, far worse than the cave of the Cyclops.